Your Excellencies, the Vice Chancellor of FNU, the Dean of the school, members of the FNU Council, invited speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Bulavinaka, good morning. We just drove in from the G77 meeting this morning, and it's a very exciting time for us in Fiji, of course, to have such gatherings of world and prominent leaders. And I think it's very, very fitting that FNU, in fact, timed the conference with the G77 meeting because it does place prominence to the fact that Fiji does play a pivotal role within the region, as this is not just a conference for Fiji, but also for the Pacific. Many of the things that I wanted to say, the Vice Chancellor has already said. They say, what great minds think alike, what fools seldom differ. And I think we're probably in the latter, both of us. But ladies and gentlemen, just picking up on the point about what the Vice Chancellor said, I think it is critically important to highlight the fact that there has not been collaboration between the academic field in Fiji and the private sector to the extent it should have happened. And I think this is very, very critical. I see some business people here, and we need to encourage them. And of course, they need to also see the benefits of ensuring that with their participation in the academic field, it does also have some very practical and tangible impact in the investment sector and indeed in businesses. It gives me much pleasure to be here, as I've said. I'd like to, by way of introduction, in particular for those of our overseas visitors and also to the locals, highlight to you some of the key features regarding investment in Fiji. And I know the conference is about investment and finance, and the reason why I'm highlighting this is to put on the floor the discussions, or at least some food for thought in respect of the discussions you'll be having. And let me start off by saying that the Beni Brahma government has in fact put investment as one of its key priorities because it does create jobs. It does lead to growth in the economy. We've lowered, for example, corporate tax rates to 20%. Only a few years ago it used to be 31%. 18.5% for companies that are listed on the South Pacific Stock Exchange. 17% for companies that set up regional or global head offices in Fiji. Already one company has done that, which is ANZ. ANZ is moving its regional head office from Melbourne to Suva very, very soon. And I see that one of the speakers either later today or tomorrow is the CEO of ANZ, Vishnu Deo. Now, we've also created tax-free zones, or for example, in Vanuatu, in Lomaiviti, in Kandavu, in Lau, and of course Rotuma. We've set up, for example, also as announced by the Prime Minister, a 20-year corporate tax holiday from Korovo all the way to Korovo all the way to Tavua, in respect if you set up a dairy farm. If you get into agriculture, there's a 13-year corporate tax holiday or 13-year holiday. We abolished duty for imported plant and machinery if you want to set up a manufacturing plant, or if you want to, for example, import equipment for renewable energy. Now, these are all very targeted and concerted efforts towards addressing, not just in terms of encouraging investment, but also in terms of addressing some specific structural issues or balance of payment issues that we've had. We emphasize the importance of value adding. Many of you may not know, but Fiji's had the largest planted mahogany forest in the world. Now, this was planted back in the 50s by the British government. It's one of the positive things they did. And it's all maturing. The Fiji Hardwood Corporation was set up in 1998, but it did not make a single dollar of profit until 2007. It was given a $25 million grant. It has a debt stock of $19 million. And yet you have the largest planted mahogany forest in the world. You had landowners who were paid 2 or 5 shillings for leasing of their land. The question that needs to be asked is, Why did they go and make a profit only in 2007? Today, through the Mahogany Industry Development Decree, we have now licensed mahogany harvesters on certain conditions that they need to have value adding. We now have an American company that makes guitar necks and bodies, and women are being paid $5 an hour for that. The emphasis is being on value adding. The emphasis is being on that landowners get a better or bigger and better and sustained stake in this particular industry. We've now registered the pure Fiji mahogany brand in about 25 different countries. Enormous cost, but what will mean the value of Fijian mahogany will increase substantially. We've obviously embarked on a number of reforms as far as investment is concerned, or foreign investment. The rules have been relaxed. We've revolutionized the telecommunications industry. It's been liberalized. We had only one provider of mobile phones. We had only one provider of landline. We had only one provider of international calls being made out of Fiji or into Fiji. Now, competition has been introduced, but obviously there's numerous repercussions, or ramifications, I should say. How do we manage that competition? How do we ensure that there's no anti-competition? And of course, the Commerce Commission comes in. We've got a lot of people who are speaking from Commerce Commission. We've reorganized spectrum allocation. I mean, these are very, spectrum allocation. Now, people do not know this, but spectrum or frequency is like limited real estate. You know, before, when somebody wanted to, for example, set up a local community radio station, the Ministry of Communication would just pick up the national spectrum broadband, just give it to the spectrum and give it to them. They don't need it. They need a very narrow band. So there's been an entire reorganization of that. And I found it really, really funny when in Australia or New Zealand journalists rang me up and said, "You're limiting media freedom." In fact, we are not. It's the reverse. By ensuring that you allocate spectrum in a managed fashion, you actually allow more entrants into the market. Fiji, within 2 years, can go digital. You have digital television. You allow more television stations to come in. You allow more channels to be shown on your TV screens. We will be, in the next month or so, be auctioning the 4G spectrum. So your internet speeds become faster. We have recently advertised, as you may have seen in the papers, the identification of areas in Fiji where there's no network coverage or very limited network coverage. So government is now going to subsidize telecommunications companies to go into those areas. You may have only 20 families living in an area. Obviously, it's not investment friendly for telecommunications company to put up a $300,000-400,000 tower and expect to get a return on the investment. They need a bit of a boost. So that's when government comes in and subsidizes them to ensure that there's network coverage. By ensuring you have 100% network coverage throughout Fiji, it also means access to education. Smartphones, duty on smartphones have gone. There's no duty. So hopefully we don't just use our mobile phones for voice, but use it for data. It's the quickest way of ensuring you get access to broadband. And of course, we have altered many of our policy settings across the board to ensure that investment in business becomes easier. It also includes the removal of red tape, adopting international best practices, and also ensuring that there is more stakeholder participation in the decision-making processes. Now, what do all these changes mean? These changes actually have enormous ramifications, as I highlighted. There's a need to develop clear and transparent rules. There's a need to develop clear regulations pertaining to licensing, for example, to consumer protection. The new areas of consumer rights need to be developed and indeed need to be addressed. And of course, we have to ensure, as I alluded to before, we need to ensure that there's true competition and we have to prevent anti-competitive behavior. One of the principal tenets of the Bainimarama government, of course, has been that policies need to be consistent. There's nothing like chopping and changing tax rules and regulations to send investors packing back home or wherever they come from, or back to their drawing boards. Of course, one of the other tenets is that effective government can only come through effective partnership between the public and private sectors. This is more than just an ideal. Such partnerships now exist in some of our most important areas of infrastructure, such as in our roads, where it's been outsourced, or in our ports, as you saw last week. The government signed a partnership agreement with Aitken Spence, one of the oldest companies in the world, to manage our ports. They manage ports in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa. It has enormous ramifications. At the moment, shipping companies actually charge a levy on containers that come to Fiji or leave Fiji because our ports are so inefficient. So the sitting amount of time at the dock is too expensive for them. Now, when they charge a levy on the container, eventually you and I pay for it, because obviously the supplier will pass that cost on to the consumer. So we have tried to change the investment climate by bringing about a number of fundamental changes in the economy. We take a holistic view, and we also take a long-term view. In other words, policies are put in place not just for today or tomorrow, for the short-term political gain, but they're designed for the long haul. And our goals of stimulating economic growth to create jobs and opportunities for Fiji is first and foremost. Of course, we've also made it a priority because these areas need to be also addressed to finally lay to rest the social and political anomalies that have hampered our growth in the years, in particular since independence, and deprived us of the chance to achieve our true potential. Common and equal citizenry, the depoliticization of land, and the protection of personal property, whether communally held or individually held, is critical to ensuring investor confidence and growth, and of course, loyalty to the country and the economy. And this is very, very important. People need to understand this. If you do not have fundamental rights, common and equal citizenry, then the sense of loyalty of both the investor and also the individual is minimized. People essentially will then see this university, a job in Fiji, as a means of as a stepping stone to leave for greener and better pastures. We have to address the brain drain. In order to address the brain drain, in order to arrest the situation of investment outflows or people cooking the books so they don't pay the right taxes, is to ensure that they feel that they're very much part and parcel, not just of the economy, but part and parcel of the country itself. We also now have a draft constitution that specifically includes, for the first time, socioeconomic rights for all Fijians. This includes the right to economic participation, the right to work, and the right to a just minimum wage, as well as to such things as adequate food and water, sanitation, housing. As the Bainimarama government keeps saying, these are important initiatives that we believe can help end the coup culture in Fiji and the uncertainty that has posed over the years for potential investors. There is no doubt in our minds that the self-serving politicians have been able to exploit a sense of injustice amongst ordinary people to foment the unrest. You know, as we've been going out in the consultations recently, we've been to north, to south, to Kandavu, to the Asawas, we've been to Taviuni and other parts of Fiji. And we've been very frank and open in our discussions. If you look at the events, for example, of 2000, many people who rushed across to the arrest of the then government by a group of armed men who were held hostage for 56 days, which would be sort of highly inconceivable in any modern country. But many people who were rushed there were in fact told by the politicians that everything will be hunky-dory if we get rid of this government. And if you look at the background of these people, many of these people did not have access to clean water. They do not have good housing. They do not have access to good transportation. They weren't part of any social welfare schemes. So obviously they were marginalized, economically out of society. They weren't part of society. So it's very easy to exploit them. It's very easy to say to them, come, let's get rid of these people and everything will be fine. So this is why it is critical to ensure that any future plan, any roadmap for any country, which includes your constitution, must address the socio-economic rights of people. Because it becomes an imperative, not just for the government that gets elected in 2014, or 2018, or 2022, or 2026. It becomes an imperative for every single government. Because it will be your right. And those rights are enforceable. And for those of you who may not know, for the first time in the Constitution, you'll have those rights applied what you call horizontally also. In other words, those rights will now also be enforceable, of course with a few exceptions, in the private sector. Previously it was applied only vertically, as in your right as a citizen against the state. This will be applied across the board in the private sector also. So for example, a woman who gets discriminated against because she's pregnant, or she's married, or you get discriminated against because of your culture, you can also have those rights enforced in the private sector also. And that is very important. It is also critical why the private sector needs to understand what is enclosed in the Constitution. So we've written socioeconomic rights in the draft Constitution, and to add to those, Fijians will now for the first time also enjoy an electoral system that removes the legal enforcement of ethnic voting, enshrines one person, one vote, one value, and helps voters focus on the merits of the policies that respective parties are offering. So you should be able to ask now political parties, what is your policy on education? What is your policy on housing? What is your policy on investment? What is your policy on sanitation? Whatever the case may be. So you help political parties now focus on national issues and how you will be able to be satisfied. For the first time, talking about education, it's not just a right to basic education as it was in the 1997 Constitution, but now you have a right to early childhood, primary, secondary, and further education. There's also a further obligation being placed on the state to eventually provide, or progressively provide, I should say, free education, all the way up to tertiary education. That is very, very important. It's very, very critical. So we need to take a holistic approach to achieve a new Fiji, a more modern Fiji. And it goes without saying, of course, given the conference we had, a Fiji more attractive for even the most cautious of investors. As I've said earlier on, that from your the seminar that you've got today and tomorrow, you've got a broad range of topics that are being covered. All of them are very, very important. I personally find, and I want to comment on this, is that sometimes we tend to focus more on form rather than substance. And indeed, if many people, if you look at Enron and what have you, with all those collapses of those companies, notwithstanding the fact that there were certain legal obligations in terms of complying with various forms, there was no actual, they missed the point. They did not focus on the substance. So you can just tick the box. But you need to look at what's the purpose behind ticking the box. Why is that rule there in the first place? So we can keep on talking about rules, but we need to look at the intended outcomes. The accountants are speaking here today, and they can tell you more about that. Obviously, the question needs to be asked, why? Why do we have these rules? What is the intended objective of it? If we don't question the outcome of a particular rule or a particular law, if we don't, for example, have an economic model in our mind, our analysis is bound to be subjective, not objective. And subjectivity, obviously, undermines the credibility of the academic, of the academia, as was alluded to by the VC. It always strikes me that we tend to sometimes just focus on conventional theories too often, to take preference over practical application and common sense. And I'm afraid to say some of the academics are worst offenders in Fiji. I'll give you an example. I was struck a few days ago to see a newspaper interview, I think it was yesterday or day before yesterday, given by an academic, not from this university. Perhaps I need to look at Iqbal Janif and then you all know which university I'm talking about. And while he praised the fact that 3 old political parties had now been registered to contest next year's elections, he bemoaned the fact that the government had abandoned the Constituent Assembly. The fact is that we have gone ahead with the Constituent Assembly. If we had gone ahead in the manner in which it was originally set out, we were in grave danger of not meeting our promised deadline of September 2014 elections to hold our first parliamentary elections under a new system. And had that happened, if we had missed the deadline, there is no doubt in my mind that this person would have been among the first to complain about that also. Had the long-promised election been delayed, there's also no doubt that investor confidence would have been also affected quite significantly. So we've taken a very practical route. We've taken the draft constitution directly to the people in a series of public consultations, talkback shows, etc. And that was undoubtedly a very huge success. The people, rather than ostensible representatives, became the Constituent Assembly in their thousands. They gave us their views and they are still responding. We are altering the draft to, amongst other things, strengthen the protection of land rights, in particular Itauke land rights, and of course freehold land rights. There is genuine grassroots participation, not a gab fest of the elite. But to return to the article in question, this economics professor argued quite remarkably that holding the Constituent Assembly, as was originally designed, would have spurred economic growth and inspired investor confidence. Now, how do we analyze this? On what academic basis was this statement made? What facts and figures did the professor put forward to substantiate his claim? Surely economic analysis must always be impartial and unbiased. But in this case, it's hard not to detect a political agenda. So the credibility of the person actually putting forward a theory is substantially undermined. There's no doubt we need to have frank and open discussions about the Fijian economy and the investment climate. But we need this discussion to be based on demonstrable fact, not on a personal opinion. So I urge all of you here today, economists and other academics, and those, of course, of tomorrow, our students, to always examine the facts and always be critical of the analytical tools you're using itself. Indeed, question whether the very tools you're using are appropriate or not. Don't be like some of our journalists who never let the facts get in the way of a good story, or journalists who merely indulge in the to-ing and fro-ing exercise that we so often see in Fiji. He said this, what do you have to say? Then they go back to the other guy and said, he said this, and what do you have to say? There's no critical analysis of it. There's no input of the individual to analyze the facts or the figures. Or what did this person say 2 years ago? So ladies and gentlemen, what I'd like to say is just essentially highlighting the point that the VC made, was that it is critical to have these sorts of seminars, these sorts of conferences, where you have very critical issues being discussed in a very in a deep fashion, not some paper being delivered by one person. I understand you've got various panel discussions. You've got people I know who are presenting papers who've never presented papers. The idea is to give them the opportunity to do that, get them up here on the platform. We need to encourage academic thinking, free thinking, critical analysis. Because if you look at all great societies, if you look at all modern societies, that's how they've been strong, that's how they've become great, is because they've allowed people to participate in a manner that is critical. Not critical for the sake of being critical, but have in-depth discussions, have a long-term view. I was having a discussion with an academic also not from this university, and they were saying that there is no actual economic model that's been created in Fiji in terms of how, for example, the RBF or Ministry of Finance can weigh in and look at it, in a long-term perspective. Maybe FNU is now developing it, but it has not been done for a long period of time. And it goes to the point about how there needs to be an interface between the academia, between institutions such as RBF, ministries, and of course the private sector. I urge all of you to please give your views critically. The government is very much committed. We hope to get the papers from this seminar because we ourselves need to not just know what is happening, but also learn from the discussions that will take place. There may be some words of wisdom that will come across from during the discussions that we should take on board. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the theme should be there should be more collaboration between all of us to ensure, with the long-term view, that Fiji becomes a much stronger economy. It attracts investors for the long term, not just shysters that come by the night. But we also need to encourage people and free thinking in the academia to be able to have a positive input into the growth and development of our country and also of all Fijians. So with those few words, it gives me much pleasure to open this wonderful conference on the Pacific Conference on Finance and Investment. Minaka, thank you.